Thank you, Seyom. I want to make 2 points, and one of them is to build on the broad question of is coin dead, or have we fundamentally changed our views on military and strategic policy? I know we have General Scales on the panel too, who's written eloquently on this, and I think made some very good critiques of some of what the administration said. I don't disagree with those critiques. I don't disagree with what you said, Seyom, but I also just want to make one point on the other side of things, which is also look at what we're keeping in the way of force structure. We are keeping an active duty Army and an active duty Marine Corps that are larger than they were in the 1990s, even after Afghanistan's over, even with Saddam Hussein gone from Iraq, which means that you have to not only listen to our words, but look at our capabilities. And I think that the shift from coin, while it's something we would all like and prefer, as Linda said, we don't always choose. Certainly in neither Iraq nor Afghanistan did we want to admit that these had become counterinsurgencies or complex peace enforcement missions until several years in. We've got to avoid the mistake, as we made after Vietnam and now more recently, of telling ourselves we can anticipate the character of the next war. The good news here is that the military is keeping enough capability, at least in the short term, at least before sequestration, that in theory we still have enough capability to do messy operations, whatever we want to call them, even if we don't want to and don't choose them of our own volition. The bad news is we're making a little bit of a historically normal mistake that we make, which is to decide that we've had enough of this sort of conflict, so let's just move on and not do it again. And again, I really admire what General Scales has written. I would remind all of you to go look back at what I think it was a January op-ed this year.
Yeah, 7th of January.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just point one. Point two is based partly, I've had the good fortune of learning from a lot of people in this room about Afghanistan, traveling with a number of them there. And in May, I was there with Ron Newman. Vonda had been there, and you should listen to what she learned and her stories, which are incredible. And I hope we will in just a couple of minutes. But Ron and I had a good chance to talk with a lot of Afghan political leaders and talk about not only the Strategic Partnership Agreement, but the looming 2014 elections. And if there's one main thing I want to begin motivationally with this point, it's to say we talk a lot about 2014 as the year of NATO transition to Afghan security forces. That's an important transition, to be sure. There's an even bigger transition in Afghanistan that year, and it's from President Karzai to somebody else. And that transition is bigger than the transition from NATO to the Afghan security forces in its importance and in the uncertainties that it conveys. Because we were going to leave Afghanistan at some point militarily anyway with most of our forces. We couldn't do the fighting forever for them. We had to try to turn as much of the responsibility over to Afghan forces, hoping for the best, admittedly. We can all debate whether it's rushed by a year or too slow by a year, but that basic transition by President Obama and other NATO leaders is basically a compromise of the various proposals that were out there, and it reflects some fairly standard methods in thinking about how to do counterinsurgency. The big uncertainty is who's going to replace Karzai. And if we get one of the bad guys, and there are a bunch who are thinking of running, then all bets are off as to whether we can hold on to any of the progress that we've made. On the other hand, we should never forget that as much as we see Karzai as a complex and challenging actor in Afghanistan and as many mistakes and weaknesses as he has, there actually are a number of good Afghan political leaders, and some of them are intending to think about running. Whether they have a chance is partly a question of how the Karzai political machine chooses to handle them and how the international community chooses to wield its leverage. And this gets to my one main point on this subject, and I'll be done, which is we have to start thinking hard of how do we exercise leverage over the Afghan elections of 2014. Because there's a certain political correctness that says it's their decision, keep hands off. Last time we got too involved, Holbrooke pissed off Karzai, we better not do that again. If we even voice an opinion, it's going too far. Then there's another view, which is often what the Afghan reformers say these days, which is you Americans, you have to pick sides. Because unless you pick sides and tell us who you want, we have no choice and no chance against the Karzai machine. The reality has to be somewhere in between. I don't claim to have the full answer. I'm trying to think through what I learned on this latest trip. But I think we have to send a message to Afghanistan, and you have to think about how you do this publicly, privately, etc., that if they choose the wrong person in 2014, there's no way we're even going to support a 228,000 strong security force. There's no way the United States is going to provide $5 billion a year in combined security and economic aid and keep 20,000 forces in country. It's just unthinkable if they were to choose someone like a Fahim, or even leave aside Fahim, because he's not going to win, he's a Tajik, but one of Karzai's inner circle. maybe Daoudzai, former chief of staff, or one of the Karzai brothers. One of these people, I think the chances the United States is going to come through on these big promises and pledges is next to nil. The Congress won't allow it, if nothing else. Afghanistan's not going to have a realistic chance. On the other hand, there are some at least halfway decent people thinking of running, and I think we have to, without necessarily naming names, indicate that we would be willing to try to support them. And we may have to name some names on who is unacceptable, at least in private. We can have that debate. But anyway, I think looming is the 2014 political transition. I don't want to make it sound like everything hinges on presidential politics in Afghanistan. There are a lot of smaller things we can do in the meantime and in addition, but that big change in Afghanistan has to receive more attention than it has so far.